Hi, and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video, we're going to learn the 1 to 4 player Votes for Women, designed by Tori Brown and published by Fourth Circle Games, who helped sponsor this video. The women's suffragist movement represented here was a long-thought effort to win women the right to vote in the United States, and there have been several movements worldwide, some still ongoing, and these have always been resisted. In this game, one side is fighting for a woman's right to vote while the other campaigns to prevent it. And there are several ways to play this game. 1 versus 1, 2 versus 2, or 1 versus 2. And you can play solo or cooperatively against a card-driven opponent known as Oppobot. In this video, I'm going to teach the rules for a 2-player competitive game where one player represents the suffragist movement and the other represents the opposition. Learning this mode will help you learn any of the other modes of play, but we also have a full solo playthrough on the channel to help you learn that mode as well, which I'll link to in the description below. But for now, join me at the table and let's learn how to play. To set up, place the board in the center of the play area, adding this turn marker to the first space of this turn track. The suffragist player now collects any 2 of these purple and yellow campaigner tokens. The game comes with several extras for variety, so just pick the ones you like best and return the rest to the box. Then the suffragist player collects 65 purple and 65 yellow cubes, along with 36 of these green checkmark tokens and 6 of these congressional markers. To make it a little easier for me to move things around on screen, I'm placing these components in some containers that I have. The opposition player now picks any 2 of these campaigner pieces, returning the rest back to the box. They also collect 60 red cubes and 13 of these red X pieces. These tokens have a variety of different designs, but are all known as the suffragists' buttons and are put together in a supply by the board. Likewise, there are 2 designs for the opposition player's buttons, and those go in a supply as well. Also create a pool of dice for players nearby, but leave the gray and black dice in the box as those aren't used in this mode. Any extra pieces you might have are just included to replace any you might accidentally lose, so just keep them in the box. Now find the state cards, which have this back, shuffle them, and then remove 3 randomly, returning them to the box. The rest you'll deal face up into an area that both players can see. The cards with this back are the strategy cards, which you'll shuffle into a face-down deck, dealing 3 of these face-up nearby as well, so that both players can easily see them. Each player will have their own draw deck of cards labeled with their side on the back. Now these are both set up in a similar way, so just follow the steps I'm about to show for both players, but I'll use the suffragist deck as the example. First, flip the deck over and separate it into piles of cards by the label found in the middle. This will indicate the card's era, which will say either early, middle, or late. You'll also find a single card labeled as start, which you can set aside for now. Now shuffle the late era into a face-down pile, and then shuffle the middle cards and set that on top, and finish the deck by shuffling the early cards, placing them on top. Each player will keep their draw deck near their side of the table, adding the start card that they had set aside into their hand. And that's the setup. In Votes for Women, the suffragist player has to accomplish 2 things in order to win. First, they need to convince the American government at the national level, known as the Congress, to propose a change to American law that would allow women to vote. This is known as sending the 19th Amendment to the states for ratification. It's a fancy title, but in game terms, it means getting all 6 of these pieces onto the spaces for them here on the board, and this has to be accomplished before the end of turn 6. But that's not all. Once Congress has been convinced to propose the law, the individual states of the country have to vote the new law into effect. As soon as 36 states have voted in favor of the amendment, the suffragist player wins. This will be represented by green check marks set on those states. On the other hand, if the opposition can first get 13 of the states to reject the new law, shown by an X on each state, they win. Now, of course, some of the language in this game is going to relate specifically to American history. But if you're not American, don't worry. As a Canadian myself, I had no trouble following the rules to this game, and I'm confident the same will be true for you. Also, if you want to get a feel for the incredible history behind this game, the box comes with all kinds of supporting historical documents from the time, reproduced to give you a sense of what this struggle was like and the resistance it faced. You'll also find a fantastic historical supplement with even more details. But with that understood, let's learn how you play. The game takes place over 6 turns, and each turn is broken into 4 phases, starting with the planning phase. Here, each player will draw 6 cards into their hand from their personal draw deck. And remember, you begin with a start card, so each player will now be holding 7. Then it's time for the strategy phase, which is skipped during the very first turn of the game, but I still want to explain it here. So just for a moment, let's pretend it is the second turn of the game and see how it works. First, both players should read the 3 face-up strategy cards beside the board. Don't worry, their effects will make sense by the end of the video, but for now, it's enough to understand that a strategy card has powerful benefits that can help a player who claims it. After looking them over, the suffragist player announces how many of their buttons they'll commit to pay for the ability to take one of the strategy cards. Players don't begin the game with any buttons, but we'll see how they can be collected later, and let's pretend that both players have 5 buttons each. Let's also say the suffragist player commits 3 of their buttons to this strategy phase. The opposition player may now pick to either defer, match, or supersede the suffragist's commitment. If the opposition defers, it means the suffragist pays the amount of buttons they committed, returning them to the supply. And then they get to take any one of the 3 face-up strategy cards by the board, setting it in front of themselves for use later. Rather than deferring, though, the opposition may instead decide to match the suffragist. In that case, both players must spend the number of buttons equal to the amount the suffragist committed, but then no one gets to collect a strategy card during this phase. Finally, the opposition could instead choose to supersede. When they pick this option, the suffragist must pay the amount of buttons they initially committed, and the opposition must spend that number of their buttons plus 1 more. Then the opposition player gets to pick any one face-up strategy card to collect. Just keep in mind you can never commit or choose an option that would cost you more buttons than you actually have. For example, in a case where the suffragist had 6 buttons and the opposition only had 3, the suffragist could ensure that they get a strategy card by committing 4 buttons, since the opposition wouldn't have enough buttons to match or supersede them. Either way, if a strategy card is ever taken, a new one is flipped face up to replace it. Now remember, you skip the strategy phase in the very first turn of the game, because no one has any buttons yet. But either way, we now move on to the operations phase, where starting with the suffragist player and going back and forth, each side must play a single card from their hand until they've each taken 6 turns. Since you start with 7 cards, you'll know when you've taken your last turn because you'll have just 1 card left. When you play a card from your hand, you must use it in one of 4 different ways, and we'll go through each, starting with playing a card as an event. Every card has an event printed in this area. You'll also find some text here at the bottom which explains the history behind the event, but it doesn't have any effect on the gameplay. When playing a card for its event, you read it out loud and resolve its instructions. For example, this one says to add one of each of these symbols to the Northeast region. These symbols represent the suffragist campaigners, so we would take a purple and yellow one from our supply and then add them to the Northeast region of the board. The board is divided into 6 regions distinguished by color and a space showing the region's name inside of a white-backed circle like this. So this is the Plains region. A region is further divided into 8 spaces known as states, each showing an abbreviation. In this case, we were told to add the purple and yellow campaigner to the Northeast region. And campaigners only go into the white-backed circle of a region, so we'd add them both here. Next, we're told to receive 2 buttons, which are represented by this symbol here. Remember, the buttons with these designs are for the suffragist, and the ones with these designs are for the opposition. And you can only take buttons from your side, and they're collected from the general supply and then added to a space in front of you where both players can easily see how many you've collected so far. Finally, we're told to add 2 cubes to New York, but the cube symbols show both purple and yellow. That means the 2 cubes can be any combination of those colors. I could add 2 purple or 2 yellow or 1 of each. But as stated, they must both go into New York, which is the space here with New York's abbreviation. If you're not familiar with the abbreviations for the various states, you can print out this sheet found online, which I'll link to in the description of this video. You'll notice some states don't have a lot of room for cubes, and they'll have a dashed line going to a larger space where you'll place their cubes during the game instead. Just know both the purple and yellow cubes represent the same thing: support in that state for the suffrage movement. So you might wonder, does it matter which color you place? Some events, like this red scare card in the opposition's deck, will remove cubes of a specific color, in this case, purple. So it can be wise for the suffragist player to use a mix of colors to ensure they aren't too vulnerable to an effect like that. The two colors also thematically represent the fact that the suffragist movement was made up of a diversity of organizations working towards the same goal. When you're finished resolving the event on a card, you then place it face up into a personal discard pile beside your draw deck. Now, we're not going to go through every card in the game, as how they work is described on them, but I will go over a few more examples so you can learn the remaining symbols you might encounter. If you see this symbol, like we find on this opposition card, that represents an opposition side campaigner. And in this case, we would add one from that player's supply to the south region. If you ever see this symbol, it represents a congressional marker. When you're told to add one of these, take it from the supply and place it into an empty space in this area of the board. And remember, the suffragist player needs to fill all 6 of these spaces as one of their victory conditions. There are also effects, like this one, which remove congressional markers, sending them from the board back to the supply. You'll also notice that some cards have a symbol in the area here. This symbol means the card has an effect that will last until the end of the operations phase. As a reminder of this, place the card into this area of the board with the matching symbol. And any number of cards with this symbol can end up here, and all of them are considered active. For example, this card says it can only be played if the Civil War is not in effect. So if the Civil War card was here, this can't be played for its event. It could still be played for other purposes that we'll learn about later, but for now, let's say the Civil War card wasn't here and we could play this event. Notice this has an infinity symbol in its corner. This means you add it to the matching space here, where its printed effect will be active for the entire rest of the game. A card you play that has this voting box symbol in its corner is placed into the space for it here, where it will become active during the final voting stage of the game, which we'll learn about later. Some symbols represent rolling the dice. This one refers to the 8-sided white die with values from 1 to 8. If you see this symbol, it's referring to the red 6-sided die with values from 1 to 6. And this symbol refers to the blue 12-sided die, which has an even distribution of sides valued from 1 to 4. Some events may require a certain result from a die. In this case, when playing the Union victory for its event, the Civil War card must be in play, and then you roll a red die. If you get a 3, 4, 5, or 6, you resolve the event, but if you get a 2 or 1, the event fails. However, a player can always spend a button they have to re-roll the die, and if they fail again, they can continue spending as many buttons as they wish to try again. If a successful roll is not created, the card is just discarded without effect. Some events may require that you spend a certain number of buttons. If you don't have the buttons to spend, then you can't play the card for its event. From those examples and the rules we still have yet to go over, you should find yourself able to resolve any events you encounter while playing. But playing a card for its event is not the only option you have. Instead, you can play a card as a campaigning action. Now, when you do this, you ignore what's written on the card entirely. Spending the card and removing it from your hand is just a cost you pay to perform the campaigning action. Which card it is doesn't matter. When performing this action, first count how many campaigners you have on the board, and then roll a blue die for each one. If you're unsatisfied with your roll, you can spend a button token you may have to re-roll, but you must re-roll all of the dice. And you can spend tokens to re-roll like this as many times as you like. Once you've settled on a final roll, assign each die to one of your campaigners. And then you may place that many cubes matching that campaigner's color into any of the states from that campaigner's current region. So in this case, 3 cubes for the yellow campaigner and 4 cubes for the purple one. However, during this action, there's another way you can spend buttons. For each one spent, you can move a campaigner to any new region circle, spending the points from their die on the states in the new region moved to. Just know you can't split the cubes placed from a die between 2 different regions. I couldn't drop some here, then spend a button to move and drop the rest here. I'd have to place all the cubes from the die either here or here. Speaking of which, let's see how cubes are placed. As I mentioned, the colors of the cubes you place must match the color of the campaigner you're resolving. And you can divide the cubes among the states there as you like. I could put them all in one state, put some in one, some in another, or maybe spread them like this. Just know there's no limit to how many cubes can be in a single space. Each cube represents support for that player's side. And remember, purple and yellow cubes both represent support for the suffragist player. The important thing to understand is that only one side's cubes can be in any one state. Yellow and purple can be in the same state because they're cubes from the same side. However, let's say the opposition campaigner comes here and does a campaign action in this region. They've rolled a 3, and let's say they pick this state to add their 3 cubes to. Remember though, only one player's cubes can be in a state at a time. So the first 2 cubes they would normally place instead remove the 2 cubes of the suffragist here, and then their 3rd cube would be placed into the space now that it's empty. In this way, you'll only ever have one player's cubes in any given state. And this works the same way if an event tells you to add your cubes to a state. If an opponent's cubes are already there, for each cube you would have placed, you instead remove one of theirs first. And just know, cubes are not meant to be limited. If you ever run out of cubes to place, just use a suitable replacement. If an effect like this one would let you remove cubes of a particular color, you can only remove what is on the board. For example, based on this roll, it says I can now remove that number of the opposition's cubes anywhere, but no more than 2 per state. So let's say I picked this state where there's only 1 cube. I'd remove this one, but I couldn't use the second remove I would have for this state to then add one of my own cubes. Remove effects only remove, they never add. After using a card to perform a campaigning action, set it into your personal discard pile. Now, as we'll see later, the more cubes you have on the board, the better your chances of winning the game. But there's also an immediate benefit to getting cubes on the board. If you're the first player to add a 4th cube to a state that is shown on one of the cards face up beside the board, you get to claim that card and place it in front of you. And you won't lose this card if you drop below 4 cubes in that state later. Even if later, your opponent ends up with 4 of their cubes in that state. Once you've claimed a state card, it's yours. In this way, it's a race to collect them. And we'll see how state cards are used in a moment. However, let's now go back to seeing how cards played from your hand can be used. Instead of playing one on your turn for its event or to campaign, you can spend it to resolve an organizing action. And again, when doing this, you ignore what's printed on the card itself. Instead, just take a number of your buttons from the supply equal to the number of your campaigners that you have on the board, and then add the card you played to your personal discard pile. The final way you may instead use a card from your hand is to play it to perform a lobby action. To do this, you roll as many red dice as you have campaigners currently on the board, and for every 6 rolled, you may either add 1 congressional marker to Congress or remove one. The suffragist player will want them added, and the opposition player will want them removed. And remember, you can always spend any buttons you have to re-roll, but don't forget, you must always re-roll all the dice when you use a button this way. And those are all the different ways that you can use cards from your hand. And you must play 1 card from your hand on your turn. However, either before or after playing that 1 card, you may also resolve 1 state or 1 strategy card you may have face up in front of you. The text on these is then read and resolved the same way you would handle resolving an event card. Afterwards, the resolved state or strategy card is returned to the box. And remember, you can only resolve at most either a single state card or a single strategy card, along with a card that you end up playing from your hand. And that covers all of the actions you can perform on your turn. And when your turn is over, the next player plays a card from their hand. And back and forth it goes until each player has only 1 card left in their hand. Then it's time for the cleanup phase. Any cards in this box are then placed in that player's related discard pile. Then you advance this marker to the next space and begin the next turn with its preparation phase. And that's how a turn is played. And remember, one of the key tasks the suffragist player must accomplish is filling the 6 spaces at the bottom of the board with these congressional markers. When the 6th marker is placed here, the 19th Amendment is said to have passed Congress, and now the various states must vote to accept or reject it. So pause for a moment and examine the rest of the board. In every state with at least 4 suffrage support cubes, no matter what combination of colors, you remove all those cubes and add a green checkmark token in their place. Those states have now placed their votes in favor of the 19th Amendment and a woman's right to vote. Any state with at least 4 opposition cubes now has those pieces removed and replaced with a red cross. Those states have rejected the 19th Amendment. For the rest of the game, cubes can no longer be added to a state with either a check or an X, so ignore any effects that would try to do that. With those adjustments made, the game will continue as normal, and from now on, effects that would add or remove Congress markers from the board are simply ignored. Also, as actions continue, as soon as a state has 4 suffragist or 4 opposition cubes, immediately replace them with the related green checkmark or a red X. As soon as the 36th checkmark has been placed on the board, and 36 is exactly how many checkmarks there are in the suffragist player's supply, then the 19th Amendment has been ratified by the states and the game ends in a suffragist victory. However, if the 13th X is placed on the board first, and again, that's how many X's the opposition player has, the amendment has been rejected by the states and the opposition wins. Also, if it's the end of the 6th turn of the game and the 19th Amendment hasn't been passed by Congress yet, that is, if the 6th Congress marker hasn't yet been placed on this track, the game ends immediately in an opposition victory. On the other hand, if the 6 congressional markers had been placed on the board, but no one had managed to add to the board the required number of check marks or X's to win, you advance to a special final voting stage of the game. Here you first return all of the cards in these 2 spaces back to their players' related discard piles. Then, starting with the suffragist and going back and forth, each player will take turns picking states to resolve their final votes. Let's say this state was picked. Each player then rolls a red die. We'll say this is the suffragist and this is the opposition. Each player may spend as many of their buttons as they'd like to re-roll their die. When the final die values have been set, if a player has any of their cubes in the state, they add them to the value that they rolled, and the player with the highest value wins the vote there, replacing any cubes in that state with the related check or X token. If there's a tie, as there would be in this case, the vote is won by the opposition and they place an X there. But keep in mind, any cards that are currently in this space are active during final voting. For example, this effect says that instead, the suffragist player wins any ties on final votes in a state. After one player has picked a state and the vote has been decided, the next player picks a state to roll a vote for, and back and forth it goes until eventually the suffragist has placed all of their green check marks and won, or the opposition has. Now remember, the game comes with some extra spare components, and this is why it's important to follow the setup instructions for how many check marks and X's a player starts the game with, so you don't actually continue resolving votes after a player's required number of pieces are already on the board. And don't forget, the game comes with modes of play for 2 suffragist players or 2 opposition players, and solitaire or cooperative modes, which are all explained here at the back of the rulebook. Otherwise, that's everything you need to know to play Votes for Women. If you have any questions at all about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over on the games page at Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get notification anytime we post a new video. And if you'd like to support us directly, you can join our Patreon team, which I'll have linked below. But until next time, thanks for watching.